So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so nice to see you all. So, we're going to continue here and give me a word, page 156. And so, here we're on Isidore the priest. And I came across an interesting fact about how many people in the Desert Fathers were actually priests, because all these people we're talking about, they were all monks, but all very few of them were priests. And I found something I read the other day that said of the approximately 5,000 monks that were in Egypt in these days, only 8 of them were priests. Mm-hmm. And so it gives you a sense of how rare it was for a priest to be in these early days of monasticism. And the reason for this is because in those days, this is a very early time in the liturgical history of the church. It's like 4th century, and this is way before, for example, Saint John of several hundred years before Saint John of Damascus composed like the Parakritiki, the 8 tones of the services, and even this is even before Saint Savas and who arranged the Typicon. So in these days they didn't have the structured services that we have now. Things were very in a very fluid, sort of spontaneous state, and so that's why also they didn't have a lot of priests to do the service, because they didn't really have the services as we know them now. So anyway, so that's why if someone was a priest, they'd say, Isidore the priest. He's like, wow, he's actually a priest. So okay, so let's see. So I'm gonna skip the first few things. I mean, and just go on to number 4 of Isidore the priest, and it is on page 157 near the top. And he said, if you are practicing ascesis, if you're struggling spiritually, that is, according to the rules, don't be conceited and puffed up when you're fasting. And there's a very important thing that's throughout the teachings of the church about fasting. Yes, it's good to fast, but it's easy to fall into the trap of the Pharisees. Like, remember in the parable of the publican and the Pharisee, one of the things the Pharisee boasted about is, I fast twice a week. It's like, wow, I'm great, and so it's easy to be puffed up about these things. And then he says, for if you become arrogant on this account of fasting, it is better to eat meat, because it is better for a person to eat meat than to become puffed up and boastful. And so one thing, the reason he says it like this is because in those days, well, actually, right from the beginning of monasticism, there was an ancient tradition that monks would never eat meat. And so, for example, in very early, even in the 3rd century, one thing the Origen mentioned, he said we monks, we abstain from meat because we want to, and then he quotes Colossians, says, put to death whatever belongs to our earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires. Whereas the Pythagoreans, these are the Greek philosophers who also in those days would not eat meat, it says they would do it for the sake of the myth of the reincarnation. So they had it so the way the Pythagoreans in those days, in the 3rd century, they would be vegans because they had some sort of spiritual idea that there's reincarnation. And so it's sort of like what we have nowadays too, because there are a lot of people now who are vegan, but not because they're Orthodox, but because they have some sort of, whether it's some sort of Buddhist or Hindu or whatever idea that there's something. So yeah, so we do it for the sake of putting to death for a spiritual struggle. And I also wanted to quote something from also Saint Anthony the Great. He is also one, very early 3rd and 4th century. He said, he also included this in his monastic canon. It says, do not eat meat at all. And so then several centuries later, in the 9th century, Theodore the Studite, who is in Constantinople, he said he was making a comparison between the monastic life and the married life. And he said, God did not give 2 gospels, one for the married people and another for monks, The gospel is the same for everyone. In other words, the teachings of the Christ are same for everyone. He says the only differences in lifestyle between the faithful married man and the monk are marital relations and eating meat. All the other commandments, love for God and for one's neighbor, faith and trust in God, patience in afflictions, humility, almsgiving, prayer, forbearance, repentance, fasting, chastity. St. Theodore says all of these are commandments of God for all without exception, both laymen and monks who desire their salvation. So what St. Theodore the Studite is saying is that the only difference between monks and lay people is the fact that lay people can get married and that lay people can eat meat. So it's very much ingrained into the conscience of the church that monks don't eat meat. And there was an elder, Basil of Poiana Marului in Romania, who wrote a whole essay on the monastic abstinence from meat. And he pointed out that there is a great multitude of holy fathers, both hermits and those living in communities, who received food sent to them directly by God, but the food they were sent by God was never meat. And likewise, when the Virgin Theotokos herself, out of love for monastic abstinence from meat, in a personal visitation, gave these three commandments to that blessed Dositheos. And this is the Dositheos who was the disciple of Abodorothus that we read about. She told him, fast, do not eat meat, and pray frequently. So it's clearly something very important for monastics. But now I'm going to say, well, why is it so important? And there's what Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain wrote in his commentaries on the Rudder, on the commentaries on the canons of the Church. He had this to say about it. He said, monks ought to abstain from eating meat because of three good reasons. First, because the aim and end of the monastic profession is sobriety, virginity, and the restraint and suppression of the body. But the eating of meat, which is the richest of all foods and fat and grease, is in consequence unfavorable to sobriety and virginity, which is the same as saying that it is unfavorable to the aim and end of the monastic life, owing to its tendency to tickle the flesh and to raise a war of wanton appetites and desires against the soul. And then he goes on to say, accordingly, if, as St. Basil says, monks ought to restrict themselves to a diet that is not rich, but on the contrary, of little nutritiousness, and if they ought neither to eat the more savory and flavory foods, since these conduce to the development of a love of pleasure, how then can it be said that it is all right for them to eat meat, which is the richest of all foods and the most nourishing and the most savory and flavory? And so, and this is something, when we see the reason for the monks eating meat, we can also see why even though lay people can eat meat, it's something that you can ask yourself, well, wait a second, maybe this isn't actually to my benefit at all, actually, to eat meat, even though I could. There's no rule that says I couldn't. Were you raising? Oh, okay. And this has to do with just the whole idea of having too much pleasure. And Elder Emilianos of Simonos Petrus had something very interesting to say about how the pleasure of food is something we need to watch out for. So he's talking about specifically about meat. So he says, the ancient monastic custom of not eating meat does not mean that it is a sin for a monk to eat meat, but this custom exists because meat, cooked in various ways, becomes enticingly delicious. Furthermore, it is a food that greatly fortifies, whereas a monk should live in abstention. That is to say, a monk should weaken his body instead of feeding it. First of all, meat fattens the body, and second, it weakens the personality of man because he learns to take pleasure. And now here's the real kicker, what he says. He says, a man who takes pleasure, whether in sleep or in any other enticing activity, is unsuitable for spiritual struggles. And so this is quite a demanding statement. He's saying that if we take pleasure in something, whether it's something delicious like nice meat, or even in sleep, which of course is something we all need to do. We all have to sleep. But if we're taking pleasure in it, it's going to render us unsuitable for spiritual struggles. And so let me ask you guys, so why do you think these pleasures would make us unsuitable for struggling spiritually? Is that something that's, do you see the connection?
It's just not a conducive environment.
It's not a conducive environment.
Right. When I think unsuitable, it reminds me it's not conducive, right? It just doesn't encourage the environment.
Yeah. So if you're in a mindset of chasing after pleasures, then to start doing some spiritual struggle as we going the opposite way. Yeah. Yeah. Any other comments? Yes.
That's what I wanted to ask. Is it the reason we know from the Old Testament that Adam wouldn't eat the creation?
Yeah. So it is true that the Holy Fathers, when they talk about Adam and Eve in paradise, they say that the very first commandment human beings ever had was a commandment of fasting, of controlling themselves. And it's so this idea of self-control, this is something that's very much deeply ingrained in what we need as human beings. And the reason we need self-control is because this has to do with what I've said other times about the opposite of pleasure being joy. Because if we do something that gives us pleasure, more often than not, we're sacrificing a long-term joy. And vice versa, if we're doing something that's going to give us joy and satisfaction in life, it's usually a lot of hard work and unpleasant in the moment. So there is this trade-off. The more pleasure you get, the less joy you'll have, and vice versa.
And one more question. I'm sorry. When someone wants to have a spiritual life, but then has this tendency of eating and whatever, like you go to places and they have meat, and you don't want to say no, or you want to eat it. It's not that you don't.
Yeah.
Losing, is it a very thin line of when you're gonna start losing the spirituality out of what's the balance? Because sometimes we say everything needs a balance in life.
Yeah.
Especially when you have children, or because they can be raised without meat. I know a family that does that, and there's nothing wrong with the children. It's like, how much are you willing to go against the whole society of what else are we gonna eat other than how much are we gonna try to give them all the whatever is good for them? We have to look at us more of are they being raised right, or are they growing right? And then as a mom, you're gonna eat with them.
So one thing about food, and I would say life in general, is that the way God created the world, he did create it to be a very beautiful and pleasant place, in the sense that food does taste good, even if it just just some boiled vegetables. I mean, you can appreciate the taste even of that, and even more so, more intensely. But also even just the beauty of creation, like you can go outside in the forest or in nature and just be really overwhelmed by its beauty, and that's pleasure. So pleasure isn't something that's inherently evil or bad or wrong, but the problem with very intense pleasures is that they have a tendency of overwhelming us. In other words, if you have, let's say, like a cake that's double chocolate fudge, whipped cream, and just all this stuff that makes it just like blows you away.
But it's not even healthy for you. I mean, it comes to the point that everything that is so much pleasure is not healthy.
So it's true that usually the things that are very pleasureful are not so healthy, because they have a lot of sugar or a lot of fat or a lot of salt. But actually, even if you did make like a super healthy dessert, you can make a dessert that's so delicious and made out of all organic, whatever. It's still dangerous, because the problem with these very intense pleasures is that they will enslave us and they'll captivate us. So the essence of, let's say, the sin of gluttony, it's not the fact that something tastes good, but it's the fact that your will is being captivated and
There.
enslaved
There.
to this thing.
What are you gonna cook? How are you gonna cook it?
And then also when you start eating, you can't stop.
Exactly.
Like you
Okay.
can't stop
Now I
eating just one
understand.
Dorito. You just keep.
Yes.
Yes.
And so the point that the Holy Fathers are trying to say is that we want to be free. We never want to be enslaved to any kind of desire, because if we're enslaved to a desire, then we're actually weak. And the weaker we are, then the weak in terms of gluttony or pleasures in general, the weaker we'll be able to follow our conscience and live, to live.
And that's exactly what it is. I feel like the following of your conscience, because once also you fall in the trap of feeling weak, then there's a struggle of getting out of that hole as
Yeah.
well. Because let's say I'm very weak, I can't stop eating meat. Let's say
Yeah.
knowing that, I struggle there of how am I gonna stop it? Like how is that gonna end? Instead of spiritual life, like okay, don't think about it, move
Yeah.
on, and slowly but surely you're gonna get out of that hole. Some
Yeah.
people, we fall into the tendency of like, I'm never gonna get any better. I'm like all this, and
Yeah.
then they stop trying.
Yeah.
We stop trying.
Yeah.
Well, we were saying earlier that like decadent food and sleep or whatever kind of
Yeah.
pleasure that is gives us immediate pleasure,
Yeah.
immediate gratification, where the fasting is more like in the distance, like that's what we're seeking for.
Yeah. So the thing I would say in general, anything that's virtuous is something that takes effort. And if we're not willing to make that effort, but we're enslaved to the idea of pleasure, then and our motivation is based on what's going to be most pleasant in the moment, then we won't be able to follow our conscience very easily, or there'll be a real struggle because your conscience is saying, do this, make this sacrifice so that you can have this long-term gain. But then your pleasure desire is like, yeah, but this would be more pleasantful. And this has to do not only with food, but life in general. So
it really has to do with how much you love Christ. Because if you really want to find Christ, you're gonna have to stop your idea of the immediate pleasure. Constantly.
Yeah. And that's something that's extremely challenging, especially for us nowadays in 21st century Western world, is that we because science and everything has progressed so much, it's so easy for everything around us to be pleasureful. So like even like the chair you're sitting on, it's nice and cushiony. Like the air you breathe in your you have these air fresheners everywhere, and you have and you have music playing in all the stores, so wherever you go, and so you're constantly bombarded with more and more pleasure all the time, and for us to not be enslaved, that's a real challenge. And specifically with music, one interesting thing I noticed in Saint Paisios, he said he once criticized even ecclesiastical music that got too pleasureful, and specifically it was this. He said that that some people when they're chanting Byzantine music, what they'll have the person doing the melody and the e-song, right? That's the traditional way of that Byzantine chant is done. But then he said, but what some people do is, in addition to having the e-song and the melody, the melody and the e-song at a steady, what they'll have is another person with a very deep voice singing the e-song at an octave below the other guy doing an e-song. And he said that this creates a very powerful sweetness that's just too much, and which is actually I felt really bad about afterwards, because after I read that, because
Going for that.
because actually what happened was when I made my first CD of Byzantine chant, there's the one in about had selections from the Vigil of Saint Anthony in Greek. What I did was I actually had 3 separate tracks recorded on it. The first track was just me doing the melody. The second track was me and 2 other monks doing the Eson. But then the third track was a separate recording of me doing the Eson by myself, which the sound engineer made it lowered it artificially an octave lower, so it sounded like there's this guy with a really deep voice that made, and the result is just so rich. And so this CD was like thousands of copies were sold. so but then after I was like, oh whoops, I guess St. Vincent wouldn't be very happy about this CD.
Because you made the pleasure.
So I added extra pleasure to it to make it, and so
everything needs the accuracy, right?
so it is.
But you didn't know better.
I didn't know, but it doesn't. I mean, still, Christ says if a person who knows the will of God and doesn't do it will be beaten with many lashings, but a person who didn't know the will of God and didn't do it will only be beaten with a few lashings.
Oh
So I'll be
that
beaten only with a
cool.
few.
It sounds cool, right? If you think about it.
So I mean,
think about our fathers, right? They didn't know, and
yeah.
now that we know, like, it's probably going to be so much worse for us,
But when we were talking,
and even worse for our kids.
we're talking about food and everything, that there's so many countries people don't have anything.
Yeah.
And then and I don't want to say something that doesn't sound right, but it's not the it doesn't bother me. It doesn't prevent me, I'm sorry, that's the right word, from believing more or less. The fact that in half of the rest of the planet is like all of and India is like literally they're going through what we should do willingly, like you know what I'm saying? Like they even
Force fasting.
They're force fasting, exactly. Even that they must give me. It doesn't touch us. Like it doesn't move us to start thinking that we can't even do it like with our own mind. Like people can't. Like I saw my daughter yesterday. She went like this to the plate of food.
Oh, she pushed through it. She didn't want it.
And it was so fun. Like I literally felt like a sack of anger. Like there's so many children dying right now as we speak. And that's what I told them. You're just thinking you're gonna get another plate of another different kind of food. I mean, if kids are raised like that, of course they're gonna do it. I mean, she's not raised like that, but she thought she can pass it to me. Like it's not gonna go through. Like you're gonna either eat or you're gonna sleep. Instantly. It's like she's like, oh my god, I eat it. I'm like, okay, there's so many kids that are going to bed without being fed. It's okay. Let's experience it. You know what I'm saying? It's because we have everything, as you said.
We're spoiled.
And especially from this age.
And so that's I'd say this is actually one of the values of fasting, because it's an opportunity to unspoil ourselves, even just for a little bit. I mean, even though the rest of the time we have it very easy, but at least for these Wednesdays and Fridays, and then during the fasting periods of Lent and everything, at least, and then we can say, okay, let me at least deprive myself a little bit, then.
So I have a question, Papa. I was listening. I was listening to a priest, and his name now escapes me, but he was mentioning that our like Prabhupadas, like way back generations, were saying that when they fasted for their enemy, not specifically for themselves. So is that true?
I mean, like, fasting for the enemy, saying like, as a prayer for them.
For them, and not so much for like they might have fasted for themselves, but more for like this person. Like this person isn't well, or this person amatai or sinning or did something to her or to me, and I'm praying for and fasting for their salvation.
And this is something. Exactly. So this is something that it is a very pious tradition that people would not only pray for people that need prayers, but even do extra struggles. Like they would fast. They would today I'm going to fast because I want to help this person who's sick, or I want to help this person not be angry with me, or and also other people who would say, okay, I'm going to sacrifice this, I'm going to give up this bad habit in order to help my daughter who really needs extra grace. Or and even Saint Joseph the Hesychast would do this. I mean, he would once one of his disciples was asked him, he said, yeah, you're fasting again, but why? It's not a fasting time. And Saint Joseph said, yeah, I'm fasting extra hard now because I want God to give more grace to you, my spiritual children, my disciples. So yeah, so this is something we can do as an extra sacrifice for someone else we love and care for.
Like a very big, a praying person told me that if you want to really feel the tapinoso,
The humility.
the humility,
Yeah.
when you say the Jesus prayer, say it for someone else, and then at the end add that through that person's prayers saved me as well, even if they're not praying. Like you're putting yourself so down in order to understand that God will at some point work on that person in a mysterious way if you're praying for that person, you know. And then you put yourself out, and then through that person's prayers, help me, save me as well.
Yeah.
So it really touched me. I felt like sharing that.
Yeah. Oh, and I see some people are writing messages. Says one person said, it is very hard to help kids to control pleasures. They like sweets so much, screen time as well. It's a pleasure for them. I have a difficult time explaining this to my kids. Yeah, and that I mean, and we have a difficult time even controlling our own, selves. I mean, our own cutting out sweets or reducing screen time, and so so it's especially for children, be even harder because they don't have the maturity that we have, and so. Yeah, so so until a child does grow up, it won't work to say to a child, "Oh, don't eat these sweets because you'll get osteoporosis." They won't care. They'll say, "Oh yeah, sure."
Isn't it that somehow like the devil? That's how he introduced the apple, the capo. Like he introduced it. Like they knew. But then he gave the pleasure of what's gonna happen.
Yes. So when the devil tempted, when the devil tempted Eve and Adam in paradise, he was saying, yeah, but it's so good, it's so this, and just by the way, just to set the record straight in terms of what the fruit was in paradise. I mean, so some people have this idea that it's an apple. and the reason for this actually has to do with the Latin word for the word because it's mentioned there's the fruit, it's the tree of knowledge of evil and good, and the word in Latin for evil and the word in Latin for apple are like the same thing. It's both like mala or something. I can't remember I don't know Latin, but yeah. So they both they both sound very similar, and so people just assume that it must have been an apple tree, but actually what the Holy Fathers say is that it probably was actually a fig tree, and for two reasons. One reason is because immediately after the fall, it says in the Bible that they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. But the other reason is actually quite interesting. They say that it was probably a fig tree because figs are something by nature that are super, super sweet, but afterwards they get your hands are all sticky.
You get in trouble.
So it's like just like sin. It's just like it's really, really nice, but then afterwards you're like, oh, that's the stuff I need, Not to say, of course, that figs are sinful, but I mean it just, or perhaps it was some other thing like a fig tree, but
And isn't it the fig tree, Father, that Jesus, in one account in the gospel, actually
cursed?
cursed?
Yeah. So that there's definitely something going on there. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
You have a question? It's okay. I was going to say,
Everything's so obvious.
we live in such a culture of indulgence that, like, growing up, we'd be like, "Oh, I shouldn't have that cake," but then you'd be like, "Oh, I'll just have it now and say no tomorrow." But if you look at it and say, "Okay, I have the choice. I have the choice of whether to take it or not to take it, but I'm the one that's in control, not the cake."
Yeah.
You know, it's almost like an exercise.
Yeah, it is
That's
exercise.
helpful.
Yeah, it is.
Of just saying, oh, I'll
Yeah.
start tomorrow. You'll never start.
Yeah.
We'll never start,
Yeah.
right?
I always think of how the pateres see us as of like,
Could I be at this?
okay, like, but they fight over a piece of cake. Like,
Yeah.
bullshit.
How low,
How
how
low
silly
was
we are.
that?
Yeah.
And what are we talking about at the end of the
Yes,
day?
yes, yes.
Like, seriously.
There was a father in Greece that said, us Christians these days, we're like Kurabiedes. At the smallest thing, we just crumble.
Oh, those yeah,
You know,
those
like,
cookies that
yes,
you
they
the
go
powder
powder.
cookie. Yeah.
And they're powdered.
We're probably
Yeah.
like, we need
Yeah.
help.
Yeah, and this is just one thing I'll just add to this is that one thing I noticed about Yaron Ephraim living with him. I mean, he didn't have a sweet tooth. He wouldn't eat. I mean, that wasn't something that he was doing. But I mean, but there were times when he would eat. You know, something like there was one person that would bring him ice cream, and you know he would be able to eat it and enjoy it, and I guess that's the difference between being enslaved to a pleasure and being able to glorify God for a pleasure. It's and this is perhaps you remember that Saint Nona, who was a bishop. One day he was teaching his priest some things, and then a prostitute drove by or rode by on a whatever horse or whatever it was, and all the priests were like, "Oh, we don't want to look at her," but he was like, "Wow, and then of course he was saying he was just moved to tears, saying, "Wow, amazing how God can make such a beautiful person." So he wasn't full of lust. He would just this thing that would have been a temptation for other people. He was able to keep his mind on God and have that pleasure be something that reminds them of God. Whereas for the average person, if they're something with too much pleasure, it'll captivate them, and then they'll forget about God and just be attached and enslaved to that. And so the same thing with food too. So if you know that's why a saint can eat ice cream in a very different way that we would eat ice cream. Of course, the same we eat it and just be thanking God and be just so moved that there is such a wonderful thing called ice cream.
But not like I have to have the next 5 days.
Yeah.
But isn't it a video that said that imagine people who have so much love towards something, they turn it towards God. Imagine how much they're gonna love God. A person having the ability, even to love food that much, or even having the ability to love anything this much. Like a prostitute that loves to sleep with so many different men. If he would say, imagine God just turns her head, and that love goes towards him. Like it's gonna be inevitably a saint, that person. Because it's just a switch. It's just one small switch that you just realize things.
Okay, and so just to wrap things up with the meat thing, I just wanted to add just one little more thing that according to the Holy Fathers, monks can eat meat when they're very sick, and this goes to show there's nothing inherently evil with eating meat. It's just something that it should be under very specific circumstances that you eat it. In fact, like Elder Ephraim, when he was with Saint Joseph as a guest for a while, he was on the verge of getting tuberculosis, and so Saint Joseph with the Hesychast would give him meat like every day, even during Lent, and this is for years. And
imagine the Pirasmos he was going through.
Yeah, because he was thinking,
he was thinking probably he's the worst monk on the planet.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, so now we can move on to number 5 on page 157, and this is Isidore the priest, where he says, persons under instruction must love those who are their instructors like fathers, and fear them like rulers, neither diminishing fear through love, nor obscuring love through fear. And so what he's talking about here is when you have an elder, you have your spiritual father, and this would apply also to people in the world. If you have a spiritual father, yes, you should love them and fear them and have both. And this is something that's actually a very healthy thing to do. Like, for example, Saint Ephraim of Kapanakya said about his elder, Saint Joseph, he said, I never loved and and feared a person more than I love and fear my elders, Saint Joseph. And I just want to say a few other things, what some of the saints have said about this idea of loving and fearing your elder. There's a recent saint, Arsenius Boca from Romania. He said, he said, it is better that your disciples love you. And he's speaking to a priest, evidently. It is better that your disciples love you rather than fear you, because fear engenders hypocrisy and lies, whereas love engenders truth. And Blessed Augustine, he basically agreed with this, but he had a little more austere approach. What he said is, let the abbot uphold discipline while instilling fear. And though both are necessary, he should strive to be loved by you rather than feared, ever mindful that he must give an account of you to God. And some of these things are also applicable to parents too, because I mean, obviously your parents, I mean, your children should love you, but also having some fear is actually a healthy kind of thing. And Elder Emilianos had something to say about what Blessed Augustine said. He said, Saint Augustine is not doing away with fear, because if a person is loved without inspiring fear, this means that he is not honorable, and that his love is not God's kind of love, but it is human love. A spiritual father's love is in the form of God's love. It is a love befitting God if it is coupled with fear towards him. Fear is an element that manifests on the one hand the authenticity of the elder, and on the other hand, the authenticity of disciples' obedience and love. Love towards God or towards the elder is inconceivable without the element of fear. So,
Could you talk more about the fear? Like, what kind of, can you define the fear that you're talking about?
So because there's more than one kind of fear. I mean, the sort of elementary kind of fear, the beginner's kind of fear, is when you're afraid of disobeying the person in charge because you're going to get punished if you disobey. So that's one level of fear. But then St. John, the theologian, in his epistle, he says, perfect love casts out fear. And he's talking about, so what he's talking about there is that when you really love God, you're not afraid of him anymore, but you love him, and that's your motivation. And there's also what, like St. Anthony said, he said, I no longer fear God because I love God. And so, but Abbot Dorotheos commented on this. He says, but there is a kind of fear that even the saints have towards God. And there's not the fear of being punished, but the fear of upsetting God, of making him sad. And so this is the perfect kind of fear. There's a very noble kind of fear where you care so much about God that you don't want him even to be sad about anything that you've done or said. So,
and I feel like when children lose that kind of fear of, I might upset my mother doing that.
Yeah.
Older, not like when they're little, because little they don't understand. But being after 12 years old, will that upset my parent? Like if I do it, or it's fine. And I feel like if they get to the point that they don't care about that, that's how they can't even find out later on. Like, how will you be afraid of upsetting God if you are not afraid of upsetting a person you can see?
I agree that if we don't have a healthy relationship with our parents growing up, in other words, if we don't learn to both love and fear them, our parents, well, then it'll be much harder for us to have that healthy love and fear also for God in our own our own inner life. Yeah. It's not to say it can't happen, but it'll be more work.
So, are the monks taught that, or how do we teach our kids? Not teach, but how do we do? Is it our prayer that we help a child to be afraid of? Is it our humble?
So, this is a very good question. In other words, how can we inspire our children to love us and to fear us in a healthy way? And Yeah, I don't know. Does anybody who's raised kids have an answer to that one? I mean, I can just say that for in the monastery, which is where I have had experience. I mean, of course I was in the sense I was almost spoiled in the sense that I had Elder Ephraim as my elder all those years, and for him it was so very natural to love him and fear him that it was just it wasn't something that he had to do or say. I mean, I guess, well, I put it like this: we loved Elder Ephraim because he himself had won our hearts. He was someone who had displayed so much love and humility and self-sacrifice and care and sweetness, and he just he had all the virtues, and that was something that made him very extremely lovable by anyone who got to know him. And so he won our love and our trust by the way he lived his life. And then in terms of fear, um, yeah, I would say I had both kinds of fear. I had the kind of fear that I was afraid that he would be disappointed if I mess up in some way. But I also, at the same time, I also was afraid that he might, give me some strict punishment if I do something bad. Like I remember once he there was so there are two in there he usually had two cell attendants throughout the years, and but he told us that um, whenever there's messages or mail or something, don't just interrupt him every hour, every 2 hours when there's some new message or some new piece of mail or whatever. Give it to me at a good time. So bother me. And so okay. So then what happened was there was some packages Gerondisa Fevronia sent from Greece to Gerondas for the church we had just built, had some ecclesiastical things, and it came in some boxes. And so of course his cell attendants got the boxes, but then we're like, oh, but okay, we don't want to bother him knock on his door right now. We'll just put it in the closet here and we'll wait. So this afternoon, when he comes out, we'll tell him about it then. But something just happened that we didn't catch him that afternoon. He was whatever. And then we said, okay, we'll tell him in the morning when we see him. But then again, that morning we missed him. And so it was like 2 or 3 days passed. We kept missing opportunity to give him these boxes. And then one day Yaranda said, hey, did any boxes come from Yerodis Fevronia? She said she sent them. They said they arrived already. Do you know where they are? I'm worried. And we're like, oh, Yaranda, sorry. They actually came 3 days ago. He says, what? So he said, each of you are going to do 300 prostrations, 300 litanias. Oh. Yeah. So we're like, oh. So we learned really quickly. We can't, we got to be on our toes. We can't. Yeah.
So he was expecting you to really observe him and find that moment instead of being loose, like into the moment.
So he wanted us to be more on top of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
You asked about the light life.
The what?
The like not in a monastery, but for people in the world, for
Yes.
parents and children. So I don't have I am a parent, but I probably am not a very good one. But as a child, I had the experience of having someone I loved and feared very much, and that was my grandma. And how she did it was she prayed for us. She was humble. She always sacrificed herself for her family.
Yeah.
And the love I felt from her was almost like God's love.
Yeah.
Very deep because of that, because you knew she always loved you deeply, deeply, deeply.
Yeah.
And then the fear was to not disappoint, to not make her, because she would not tell me, she would not punish me, but she would be disappointed, and I could see that. And that was worse than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very beautiful to hear. Yeah, and the truth is, Yaranda, he also very rarely punished us. I mean, I think at first he did punish us. He give these like extra prostrations or something, But I mean, I mean, but really, I mean, doing extra 300 prostrations, it's really not that big a punishment. I mean, it's not like it's painful or embarrassing or something. It just, well, you just do it and it's over with. So, and in general, you know, all the, except for in the very beginning when he wanted to to get on, be more alert and on top of things, you know, all the rest of the years he never punished us at all. In fact, after like only like 3 years of being his cell attendant, both I and Father Joseph once said to him, Miranda, how come you're not giving us any more kanun, any more punishments? He said, oh, the time for that passed. He said he wasn't. So I guess he thought, I guess in his discernment, he saw that we needed it in the very beginning, but then
We
once,
loved him no matter what.
yeah, and then once we acquire this deeper love for him, I guess, and then you know, you don't really need to be motivated by punishment, because punishment, you know, this is what they call extrinsic motivation, and they've done a lot of studies on how to be motivated to do something, and extrinsic motivation tends to work in the short term, but it doesn't really help in the long term very much. It can just help a little bit. What we really need is intrinsic motivation. In other words, to do what's right for the sake of it being a good thing to do. In other words, to be motivated out of love for a person or for a thing. And so that intrinsic motivation, if you're intrinsically motivated to do what's right, then you don't need to be rewarded or punished for something. Okay.
Do you think that's why grandparents have that ability, because they're wiser?
Oh,
Because
Yeah.
they've seen life. As we
yeah.
say,
So
like,
I would say, yeah,
how it works.
grandparents typically can be, I mean, yes, it's true. Grandparents have more experience in life, and they can be more removed from getting caught up in being controlling of their kids than the actual parents can. And yeah, and hopefully also as people get older, they become more virtuous, and so it becomes more natural for a person to have Christ-like love when they're older rather than when they're still young and still get riled up and more triggered or whatever.
And of course, the fact that they don't have to struggle for their living. Like they come to a point that most of the older people have their
Yeah,
money set, and they're just like a little bit more relaxed to that. I feel like that painful stage of how am I gonna make it doesn't help a parent to become his best, because I really believe, my personal, that most parents want the best for their children, like no matter what, like, but the struggles of life, they can't really help themselves but to be a little bit angry and a little bit upset and stuff like that.
I would say because the more stressed a parent is, the more likely it is that they'll lose their patience and not be able to behave as they want to towards their kids. Okay, so moving on. Now at the bottom, 157 and 158, there's a story of this person who was the elder saw a brother committing a sin with someone and didn't correct him. And he said, if the God who made them sees them and does not burn them, who am I to reprove them? And so he had this very sort of hands-off approach, saying, because it does say in the Bible, where God says in the Old Testament, vengeance is mine. And so there is, that is true, that, we don't need necessarily to be the policeman, knowing that God is in charge and he does, his providence is in charge of things. And we don't, even if someone seems to get away with doing something bad, we can leave it in God's hands and say, okay, well, he sees, he knows how to deal with this. Of course, that doesn't mean that you can just let your kids do anything they want or something. But I mean, it's this principle where they really had a very deep faith in God, that God really is in charge and can take care of things.
Father?
Yes, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me surely it's best to err on that side, in that direction. But like in Galatians or Ephesians, it says, brethren, if you see one is overtaken in a fault, correct him, but in meekness and
Yeah.
love and considering your own frailty.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
how do we balance that? I mean, again, I think we need to, in my humble
yeah,
opinion, you know,
yeah, yeah, definitely. And so that what you're saying, that is the more balanced approach. And one thing, and I guess this is one thing in general we see in the Desert Fathers is that they tend to go to some extremes
yeah,
as a way of emphasizing a point that otherwise we might kind of overlook. And that this isn't to say that this extreme is actually something we should follow in a literal sense, but it's something we can just have it sort of in our arsenal of tools of how to view and deal with a situation so that if necessary, we can say, okay, I I'm not gonna intervene right now. I know that God sees this and he's the one in control, and so I can just keep my hands off in this situation. But you're right. But in general, what you quoted from St. Paul, that is the way to go. In other words, if you see someone is going in a bad way, yeah, you should speak up and try to help them get out of that.
okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, I see how sometimes the fathers just need to get our attention, you know.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, let's see. I'll just skip the next 2 pages because there's not much I have to comment on that. But I guess on the bottom 159, this is a kind of a cute story. This is where an elder asked his disciple, okay, tell the brothers how to become a monk. And the disciple's like, what are you kidding me? What, you want me to teach them? And then he says, no, I don't know. Please tell them. And so then and then he says, what, you want me to be the one speaking, you get to be silent? He says, yeah, that's what I want. Yes. So then he said, okay, fine. So then John, this disciple, in order to teach them how to become a monk, at top page 160, he took off his clothes, and then his elder said, what are you doing? And then he says, unless a man strip himself of honor and praise like this, he absolutely cannot become a monk. So his elder is thinking, oh, maybe I should have asked him. No, I'm really good to that. But again, this is another example of this kind of extreme, these extremes of the Desert Fathers, where they're going to be, of course, this is not the kind of thing you want to imitate, but they just go to these extremes to make a very vivid, extremely vivid point of, okay, this is how important it is to be stripped of all kinds of honor and praise, and depending on what other people think about ourselves. Because in those days, to be a monk really was a sort of a shameful kind of thing. It wasn't a glorious thing like it is nowadays. It was like, oh, my son became a monk. I'm so ashamed of that. Yeah, he's like, because now he's like a nobody living in a shack in the middle of nowhere without any food. Yeah. What are you gonna say?
Okay, this one that is a challenging question.
Okay, hold
So
on.
now we read all these books, and other than the Bible,
Yeah.
do we imitate what we read, or do we pray to become what we read?
Yeah. So when we read these extreme things in whether it's the Desert Fathers or the Lives of the Saints, they all take discernment, and they all take whether or not we can apply it exactly as they were doing it to our lives. That really does depend on a lot of circumstances, and it's very likely that it won't apply at all to us. And so, and this is one of the reasons why it's so important to have a spiritual father, because you read this thing that of whatever in the Desert Fathers, then you say, oh, should I do this? And you ask your spiritual father, you say, no, don't take off your clothes and whatever. So that's why obedience is what saves us from these extremes.
In everything we read.
Yeah, so in all these things, I mean, I guess the general principles of what Christ teaches, these are things that are applicable everywhere, but then how you apply these principles can be very different from case to case. And then by extension, the same thing with the Holy Fathers. The principles are always applicable to everyone, but then how the application is going to look like for us in our particular case, yeah, that'll be different.
The severity of the spiritual father.
Yeah. Go ahead, Claudia.
Thank you. I want to have a comment on this. Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis.
Yes, of course.
He has a book. It's a gathering of speeches from the Second World War. It's called Mere Christianity.
Oh, yes, I've read that.
One of the chapter in Mere Christianity. So he was an atheist that converted towards the end of his life converted to Christianity. He was part of the Anglican Church, but he doesn't make the case for any denomination. He makes the case for the Christianity in general. One of the chapters is called "Let's Pretend," and he says something like that. It doesn't come naturally for us to be good, let's say. But let's think about that movie or whatever, the Phantom of, I don't know, the movie or whatever, when a person puts on a mask, a nice mask, probably, and then after a few years, so he wears the masks for a few years, and after a few years, he was very, very ugly, and this is why he puts on the mask. He gets the mask off and he realizes he's a beautiful person because he actually grew into that mask. So what he says was, let's pretend if I don't want to be nice today. These are very general principles. I don't want to be nice to people. I'll try to pretend to be a nice person. And you keep doing that and keep doing that every single day, you actually come to be it. This is what
and that is a beautiful analogy, because what happens is, if we do ask ourselves, okay, what would a patient person do right now? He would do this. Okay. And if you ask yourself every time you're tempted to be impatient, well, then without realizing, you'll actually become a patient person. And that applies to all the virtues. So so there's, that idea, that phrase, fake it till you make it. So that works.
After that comment, everybody that will come and say that, just be yourself. Like, I don't get
be
that.
yourself. So okay,
live your life.
Okay,
So be yourself. Like, I don't get that.
There's
What
a
does
cute
it
bumper
mean?
sticker I saw. Be yourself, because everyone else is taken. but to be serious though. So the idea of being yourself, there's two aspects of this. One way to be yourself is to say, well, I'm a glutton, and so I'm just gonna be myself and eat all the ice cream and not leave anything for anyone else. So that's a very bad way to be yourself. But that's the truth is that's actually not even really being yourself, because your true self is dispassionate. And the way we understand the Holy Fathers understand our soul is that it has like these parasites that latch onto it and distort our true image, the image of Christ himself. And but the problem with being yourself in that sense is that we don't want to just give in to every urge we have, because that's obviously going to be a disaster. But what they mean when they be yourself is to be honest, to be who the unique person you've been created to be, and not be try to be artificial in order to please people. So that's a very healthy
please yourself.
Well, please yourself. And okay. In other words, I want to pretend to be an important person, so I'll walk around like this. That kind of thing. That's putting on airs. That's something that's not at all spiritual. Or even if it's just for a spiritual reason, like suppose I say, oh, I'm a priest, so I gotta walk around like this and give my hand to everybody to kiss, and that in a very artificial way. That would just be ugly,
And the opposite, a monk overdoing it in front of people.
So being ourselves, meaning to recognize who we are called to, our uniqueness that God created us to be, and to be that without being embarrassed of what people might think if by following our conscience.
That's where it starts off.
Yeah.